Hello crafty friend, this is Juliana Michaels. Thanks for joining me today. In this video, I'm sharing how I created this Halloween card for the Tim Holtz Stampers Anonymous Halloween 2023 Live. I'm going to take you step by step through all the wonderful layers that came together and the process I went through to create the final version of this card. If you're interested in the supplies I've used, you can find links to them in the description box below. When you shop through those links, it supports me, and I really appreciate that so very much. There is also a blog post available with written details and more photos if you prefer that. Now let's get on with the making. I'm going to start by creating the background for this card using the stamp and smudge technique. I'll be working with the Tim Holtz Stampers Anonymous, the Obscure, and Foreboding stamp sets. These are some of my favorites from this release. For this technique, I'll be using Distress Oxide inks in Forest Moss, Carved Pumpkin, Villainous Potion, Black Soot, and Hickory Smoke. Here I'm placing a piece of Distress watercolor cardstock cut to 4 by 5¼ inches into my stamping platform and using a bit of temporary adhesive to help hold the paper in place along with the magnets. What many of you may not realize is that I usually do at least one practice run when I'm making a stamp and smudge background. Sometimes the first attempt turns out okay and I will use it, but sometimes, like this one here, the result wasn't what I was going for. But it did help me figure out what to try on the next one. Here I stamped the skull and smudged it as well, but after seeing this, I realized I didn't want that stamped image in the background, but rather that I wanted to use it as an embellishment layer. I also decided to switch up the colors a bit and not use that yellow color or as much black in the background. So with that practice one under my belt, I started on a second one. Here I'm stamping that super cool spiderweb image from the Obscure stamp set. I inked the stamp with Villainous Potion Distress Oxide ink, stamped the image, and then while the ink was still wet, I used a paper towel to dab some of the ink dry, and then use that same paper towel to smudge the ink by lightly rubbing over the stamped image, hence the technique name, Stamp and Smudge. I find that if you try to smudge without dabbing at the ink to dry it just a tiny bit, you will lose a lot of the detail of the stamped images, especially when working with these sort of super detailed images. I then repeated this process 2 more times. When I do the stamp and smudge technique, I almost always try to stamp the same color at least 2 to 3 times in various places to help spread out the color and draw your eye over the background. Next up is the weed image, and I'm stamping that one using Forest Moss Distress Oxide ink. Once again, I stamp the image, dab at any of the super wet ink areas with my paper towel, and then smudge the ink. As you can see, I'm working in a stamping platform, and I prefer it because it allows me to plan out where I want to stamp images and re-stamp images if I need to. Here it's coming in super handy to stamp 3 images at the same time. I'm stamping with Carved Pumpkin Distress Oxide ink, and those 3 images are helping to spread that color across the background. Here I'm repeating the stamp and smudge technique with the 2 flourishes from the Foreboding stamp set, and I'm inking them up with Hickory Smoke Distress Oxide ink and then smudging as before. Now on to that creepy spider. As I mentioned, I didn't want as much black in the background as the first attempt, so the spider image is perfect for getting just a small amount here and there. I then repeated stamping it across the background and smudged as I went. Here's a look at the completed stamp and smudge background. The background looked great just like this, but of course I felt like it needed a little something more. So I used the fractured stencil and the awesome black opaque distress texture paste to add that something more. So I placed the stencil toward the upper left-hand corner and applied the black texture paste through the stencil using a palette knife. I then carefully lifted off the stencil, flipped it around, and applied some more paste to the bottom right-hand corner. I carefully removed the stencil, set the paper to the side to dry, and immediately went to wash my stencil. While the paste was drying, I moved on to the embellishment layers. Here I'm stamping the skull image onto Distress White Heavy Stock using Black Soot Archival ink. I used my heat tool to help the ink dry quicker. I then used a pair of detail scissors to fussy cut the image. While I was cutting out the skull, I thought it might be cool to make this more dimensional somehow. So I stamped the image a second time and dried the ink with my heat tool. This time I used my craft knife and scissors to carefully cut out the eye sockets. I like to use the craft knife to cut an X in the area I want to cut out, and then use my scissors to do the majority of the cutting. Once I got the eye sockets cut out, I repeated the fussy cutting process for the skull. After I finished cutting out the second skull, I colored both of them using distress watercolor pencil and old paper. I like to pull the pigment from the pencil using a water brush and then paint it onto the paper. You could achieve the same result with water and a paintbrush, and if you don't have the watercolor pencils, you could also use a distress re-inker or even a distress ink pad. Just smush the ink pad onto your craft mat and pick up the ink with your brush. I colored both images, but I probably could have gotten away with just coloring the top layer and the eye sockets of the bottom layer. To make this dimensional, I added foam adhesive squares and adhered the skull with the cut-out eye sockets on top of the full skull image. I then inked the edges of my skull embellishment with black soot distress ink. Now that the paste is dry, I'm going back to add some more interest to the background. Here I'm applying walnut stain distress ink to the edges of the paper. To add a bit more distress, I applied some water by slowly pulling the trigger on my distress sprayer to make larger droplets. The water re-wets the ink and causes it to flow and move. I then used my heat tool to dry the ink. Next, I darkened the edges a bit more by inking them with black soot distress ink. I then added a few more water droplets, dabbed them with a paper towel to lift some of the ink, and then dried the paper with my heat tool. When it came time to do the sentiment, I was torn between using the sentiments from the tiny Frights stamp set and the Halloween sketchbook stamp set. I ended up going with the Happy Halloween stamp from Tiny Frights. I stamped it onto a piece of white cardstock using black soot archival ink and then trimmed it into a strip, leaving a small border around the edge. I then inked the edge with black soot distress ink. To grunge it up a little more, I applied some color using the old paper watercolor pencil on my water brush. I then laid out the pieces to see how things were looking, and I still feel like it needs something more texture. So I took the Sizzix Layered Dots die set and cut a piece of vellum using the top layer die. This felt a little too neat and clean though, so I took my old school decal edge scissors and trimmed off the edges. I used the placement of the skull and sentiment to help me figure out what size to cut it down to, and it ended up being about 3 by 4 inches in size. For the card base, I cut a piece of distressed black wood grain cardstock to 4 1/4 by 5 1/2 inches and adhered the background onto this to complete the card. Off camera, I added machine stitching with black thread to the edge of the background paper. And here's a look at the completed card. Well, not quite. I thought it was finished, but after looking at it the next day, I decided it still needed something more. I peeled off the vellum layer and the skull and the sentiment strip. I then added some Sterling Distress Foundry Wax splatters to the background by mixing a little rubbing alcohol with a drop of the foundry wax. I used a paintbrush to splatter the wax onto the paper, and then I used my heat embossing tool to set the wax. I love the tiny bit of sparkle it adds to the background. Next, because I still wasn't happy with the vellum piece, I dabbed sepia, mushroom, and espresso alcohol inks onto the vellum using a felt alcohol ink applicator tool. This scrunched it up just perfectly, and I was then happy with the card. Here's a look at the truly completed card with all the texture and layers I added during the creative process. I hope you enjoyed learning how it came together and found some inspiration for your next make. Until next time, stay crafty, my friend. Thanks so much for watching. I'm truly grateful for you. I was wondering if you could do me a quick favor and subscribe to my channel or leave me a thumbs up or a comment. If you're feeling extra generous, I'd love for you to share about my channel with your friends. All of these things help out us YouTubers so much, and it would mean so much to me to have your support.